Can you all see me? It's okay? Is it alright if I sit? Okay, I may stand also sometimes. Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Can you hear me at the back? It's okay? So I'm going to speak about Zapin in connection with worship, with what the Muslims call ibadah. Usually the two are not connected, but there's a very strong intimate connection between dance and music on the one hand, and worship on the other hand. Now, the perception of that connection, the idea that they are connected, has become something strange to Muslims. Part of the reason is because Islam, as it is understood, has become, or rather I should say Muslims have become extreme in this country. We have in the last decades been going in a more extreme way. And part of that extremism is manifested in terms of people's criticism of music, even going to the extent of saying that music is prohibited in Islam, music is haram in Islam. Certain types of musical instruments, like string instruments, are said to be haram in Islam, despite the fact that there's been a long tradition over for more than 1,000 years of not only attention to music, but even the scientific study of music by Muslim philosophers and scholars. And despite the fact that music has always been intimately connected with Sufi orders, with Sufi tariqas in the Muslim world. So that takes us to our topic. The connection between music and worship has actually to do with Sufism. And talking about Zapin is that's just one example of the connection between music and dance on the one hand and Sufism on the other hand. So in order to make that connection understood, we should know something about what is meant by Sufism, right? And that also is misunderstood in this country, partly because of propaganda against Sufism, partly because of the rise of Salafism, the rise of Wahhabism, which is anti-Sufism, and partly because there's been a widespread misunderstanding that Sufism is a sect in Islam. So you have Sunnis and you have Sufis, but this is not correct, because Sufism Sufis would argue, is the core of Islam. As Muslims, in all religions, there is a distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric, right? There is a distinction between the outward manifestations of religious practices, the rituals, the movements, the forms, on the one hand, and the spirituality that you experience. And in most religions, it would be said that the two should come together. When I said exoteric and esoteric, that corresponds to Zahir and Batin, right? The two should come together. For example, when you pray, in any religion, when you pray, if you simply mouth the words and you simply perform the movements, but there is no inner experience, then that prayer is meaningless. On the other hand, if you have the spiritual experience, but you don't do the acts, you don't do the rituals, that also lacks in meaning. So the two have to come together, the Zahir and the Batin, the form as well as the content. And this is what Sufism is. Sufism is the balance between the Zahir and the Batin. It's the balance between the exoteric and the esoteric. It's the balance between the form and the content. It's the balance between the ritual and the spiritual experience. Sufism is not merely the spiritual experience minus the rituals, because the Sufis stress that the rituals are important. And the Sharia is important, but it has to be combined with the spiritual experience. And that spiritual experience ultimately has to do with feeling the nearness of God, feeling the intimacy with God, the nearness. And that takes us to a famous hadith of the Holy Prophet, where the Prophet says, Man arafa nafsuhu arafa rabbuhu, meaning he who knows himself knows his Lord. What it means is, you know that there is a God and there is a Creator and there is perfection by looking into yourself. For example, when you look at the wonder of your own creation, of your being created, when you look at your capacity for love, your capacity for knowledge, your capacity for morality, your capacity for all these values, and you imagine that there is one which created all of this. And if you imagine, for example, your capacity for love, you imagine the possibility of perfect love. When you imagine your capacity for knowledge and power, you imagine the possibility of, or the reality of perfect knowledge and perfect power, of omnipotence, and so on and so forth. So, knowing yourself means that it takes you to belief in some higher being, a creator. Now, if we believe in God and we desire to not only believe but to feel the presence of this God, right? Now, how do the Sufis convey that desire to know God? Now, usually they convey that desire through allegories, through stories. Now, one of the famous Sufi allegories is a long poem called The Conference of the Birds, Mante Putayr, by Farid Al-Attas. Now, in this story, a group of birds get together. This is an allegory, right? So the birds, of course, symbolize seekers of knowledge, seekers of the truth. Now, these birds get together to look for the supreme bird. The supreme bird in the poem was in Persian. The supreme bird is called a simurgh, Simurgh, simurgh. Just remember that term, simurgh. This is a supreme bird. Now the birds get together, led by the hudhud, a bird called the hudhud, which is what in English? You know? I don't think it's a woodpecker, but that's a good, very good. Yeah, I think it's called a hoopoe in English. But very good, brave attempt. So the birds get together looking for the supreme bird, for the simurgh, and they travel, they fly across 7 valleys. Now these 7 valleys actually symbolize the different stages of acquiring knowledge, and it's also said to symbolize the 7 heavens, the Sab'a Samawat, which are mentioned in the Quran. And during the journey, the birds have conversations. In fact, they have philosophical conversations with each other. And during the journey, some of the birds die, some give up, and they return. So finally, the birds who are left arrive at the destination, and they are actually flying, and this is very interesting, especially for our bigoted ultra-nationalist Malays, the birds are flying not to Saudi Arabia, they are flying towards China. Why? Because a feather of the supreme bird, the simurgh, was discovered in China. And why China in the story? Why China? Because of the hadith that the Prophet says, seek knowledge unto China. Right? So they fly, and as I said, some of the birds give up and some die. And finally, 30 of the birds are left, and they arrive at the destination, but they don't see the simurgh. They don't see the simurgh. What they finally see, looking at the reflection of themselves in the water at the destination, they see themselves in the reflection. And then they begin to realize that they found the simurgh, because the word simurgh, the name of the supreme bird, also means in Persian, si-morg. Si means 30. You know, in Persian, yek, do, se, char, panch, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until 30. 30 is si. And morg means bird. So they realized that the supreme being they were looking for is in themselves. So it is, in other words, it is an expression of that hadith, he who knows himself knows his Lord. So it is not saying literally that God is in them, but rather that their search for God is in themselves, right? And that's also, related to another famous poem, that when you are searching for, there is a ayat in the Quran which says that God is closer to you than your jugular vein, right? Now, a believing Muslim believes this, but does the believing Muslim feel the closeness of God? So the Sufis want to not only know that God is closer to us than our jugular vein, but they want to feel that closeness. They want to feel that intimacy. This word uns, U-N-S in Arabic, means intimacy. And they want to experience that intimacy. To put it in other terms, they want to return to their origins. Because we come from God, we are created by God, and we come from God, and we want to return to God. So feeling the intimacy, the closeness of God also has to do with returning to our origins. Then that brings us to the next poem, the famous Masnavi of Jalaluddin Rumi. Right? In the Masnavi of Jalaluddin Rumi, the first 18 verses are about this return to origins. And it's also an allegorical poem. Here the imagery is of a piece of wood, or what is called in English reed, something like bamboo, right? So you have a ney, called what is called in Persian and in Arabic and in Turkish a ney, which is a flute or a seruling, as the Malays say, which is made from reed or from bamboo. But of course, for the seruling to come alive with music, you have to make holes in it. In the bamboo, you have to make holes in it. Then when somebody plays it, it comes alive with music. But when the seruling comes alive with music, it seems to complain that it has been separated from the reed land where it was plucked from. It's complaining of that separation. Rumi says, Beshnu in ne chun shikayat mikonad az jodaiha hikayat mikonad ta neistan ta mara beboride, and so on and so forth. This is the first few lines of the Masnavi. What he's saying, what it means is listen, the ney is the narrator. The flute is the narrator. And the flute is saying, listen to the flute complaining of its separation. And complaining and telling the story of its separation. Now, this ney is a metaphor for the human being. Because God made us from mud and made the holes and everything, eyes and mouth and everything, and then blew His breath, His ruh, into us, and then we become alive. Just like the ney becomes alive when the person blows his breath into it, the ney becomes alive with music. But when the human becomes alive and is conscious of his existence, he misses his creator. And he wants to return to his creator. Do any of you want to return to your creator? Don't bluff. Because nobody wants to die. You don't want to die right now, right? And when we are sick, we try our hardest to remain alive and to live as long as possible, and we want to live as long as possible. But, of course, those who have faith are not terribly fearful of death, but there is some fear. We do have some fear, we have to admit. The most religious of us do have some fear of death. But the Sufis, who are so certain of what life is like after death, who are so certain that it is a much better world, are not only not afraid of death, but they look forward to it. That's why Rumi called death the wedding night. Another metaphor, Shab-e Arus, the wedding night. Because what he's saying is, death is like the wedding night, the night that you are united with your lover. It is something like that, something so beautiful. So one has to think, or one should think of death in that way, because no matter how much we are so tied to this world, we have to realize, like Rumi, that this world is actually a terrible place in comparison to what we will experience in Akhirat, in hereafter. Those who are so certain about that look forward to that. And that's why the term, the wedding night. So this is basically what Sufism is about, right? And there's a lot of stress on morality, on what the Muslims call akhlaq, on spiritual values. Far more stress on that than the rules and regulations. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the rules and regulations for the Sufis are not important, that they're secondary. But the rules and regulations, the outward acts, the rituals, are meaningless without the accompanying spiritual experience. So this is basically what Sufism is about. One thing to experience the intimacy of God. The Sufis have devised various means of doing that. The continual repetition of religious formula, of what is called dhikr, right? Which literally means remembrance, is the way of contemplation and meditation. And this is where music comes in. Because this concentration, this state of concentration that you need to be in, is facilitated by music. And different Sufi orders use music in a different way. So you're all familiar with the whirling dervishes. Are you familiar with that? The whirling of the dervishes is called the sema. Sema doesn't mean music, it means listening. Because what is important is the listening to the sounds, right? The contemplation is literally a listening of the sound, because of the idea that human beings are, intimately drawn towards sound, and sound evokes certain responses in them. So music has always been important for many of the Sufi orders, and this is where Zapin comes in, right? So I hope so far you can see the connection between music and Sufism, and Zapin as a genre of music and dance which facilitates that experience. So, okay, now let's go to, we'll just skip and we'll go to Zapin. I've said that. Okay, just the slide before. Okay, now Zapin, of course, is a Malay word, and there is a dance and music genre called Zapin. Professor Muhammad Anis is right here. He's an expert on Zapin, actually. So I shouldn't be talking about this, but I plan to talk about it, and I can't change now that he's here. The Malay word Zapin comes from the Arabic word Zafin, right? Which is, the root of that is Zafana. Zafana is a verb, which literally means, if you know anything about the dance of Zapin, you can understand this. Zafana literally means to move up and down, right? So a very simple, movement, moving forward and backward. This is Zafana means to do that, to move up and down. There's in fact a saying attributed to Sayyidah Fatima Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet, that Tazfinu lil Hasan. Tazfinu lil Hasan, meaning she used to do Zafin for her son, Al-Hassan, when she was a baby. Probably it meant that, she would carry him and then would move up and down in a dance-like manner. Now, the dance and the musical genre of Zapin that we know of in the Malay world originates from the Hadramaut. Yes. So the Hadramaut is, where is it? It's in this part, in the southern part of Yemen. It is now the largest province of Yemen, and this is the region from which Islam came to Southeast Asia. Not only to Southeast Asia, also to East Africa, especially to Kenya and Tanzania, to some extent to South Africa, also to Gujarat and to Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and to Southeast Asia. So the migration of Hadramis brought the Shafi'i school of Islam to this whole Indian Ocean area. And along with Islam, they brought the Ba-Alawi Tariqa, the Ba-Alawi Sufi order, and along with that, they brought Zapin. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, so they were coming, of course, with the trade routes. So it's interesting that these various families that came from Hadramaut, like, for example, the owner of this cafe is Al-Haddad, right? Al-Junaid, okay. Al-Junaid, Al-Haddad, Al-Attas, which is my family, Al-Sagaf, and many other families from Hadramaut. They ended up going to different parts of the Indian Ocean, so you find the same families. You'll find Al-Attas in Kenya, you'll find Al-Attas in Hyderabad, in India, you'll find Al-Jufris in all over the place. Yeah? So there's kind of a diaspora, and it was a trade diaspora because they were traders, they followed the trade routes. And then they established themselves in various cities, in Mombasa, in Malindi, in Kenya, in Zanzibar, in Tanzania, in Surat, in the west coast of India, and in Calicut, in Kerala, and of course throughout the Malay world. By far the largest migration, the migration of the largest scale was to the Malay world. Right? They brought Sufism belonging to the Ba'alwi Tariqa, and they brought many things, of course, a variety of cultural practices, one of which was Zapin. Right? And here you have just an example of a majlis or a session Samra, it's called, a session of Zapin, session of music and dance, called a Samra. And the principal instrument, of course, is the gambus, right? Yeah, go ahead. Zapin, and along with one or two other music dance genres, is usually performed in the context of various kinds of celebrations. It could be a wedding, as in this case. After the wedding, you would have a samra, a session of music, or it could be religious majlis like a maulid, celebration of commemoration of the birth of the Prophet, in which there would be a religious ceremony, but that would be followed by samra. Or it could be on the occasion of Hari Raya Haji or Hari Raya Fitri. On both occasions, it's common to have samras to commemorate these festivals. These are some technical aspects which I myself am not that sure about, right? Because, what you have is we'll see a sample of it later, right? But usually you have an introduction, which is called taksim, in which the gambus player improvises, and then he's joined by the full ensemble, and the full ensemble consists of generally of various percussion instruments and a violinist, few kinds of percussion instruments, particularly the marwas, which are small hand drums, and the violinist. But the main instrument, of course, is the gambus. Okay, go ahead. All right. Now, let me before I speak about the significance of Zapin and how it relates to Sufism, maybe we should have. Let's do the Farid Al-Attas.
شربنا على ذكر الحبيب، شربنا على ذكر الحبيب مدامة سكرنا بها من قبل أن يخلق الكرم. لها البدر كأس وهي شمس يديرها هلال، وكم يبدو إذا مزجت نجم. ولولا شداها ما احتديت لحاليا، ولولا سناها ما تصورها الوهم. فإن ذكرت من حي أسبه أهلها نشاوى، فلا عار عليهم ولا إثم. فضلا بفضل المثاني، منك تفضلا.
Okay, maybe we come back to that later. Now, on that occasion, it was sort of formalized. Usually, these sessions, the Samra sessions, are informal. There are no professional dancers. They're just ordinary people. It's just like, when you go disco. Not that you do that. I've heard people do that. When you go to disco dancing, you don't learn it in a school. It's just improvised and informal. So the samras are the same way. Just members of the community grow up learning it from their parents and their brothers and sisters, and they do this. So in this next setting, this is an example of I think it was a wedding in Mukha, and then after the wedding, after the ceremony, they have a samra.
صابر عالصبر ساعة عسى بعد الصبر تشرب الحالي والصابر عند العرب ضاع وعقب الصابر مضونة يا زارعين العنب ماذا تبيعونه. وياهم على قلبي ورواني ما زال بيتهم قلبي يبيتونه ويحيونه يا زارعين العنب ما بتبيعونه.
Okay, you get the idea, right? So you can see it's a social event, right? And on the surface, it looks like people having fun. And it's true, there is that element of having fun. All right, before I explain the last part of my talk, I want to talk about the religious significance of this. But I want to show one more slide. Now this is also Zapin, but it's not from Hadramaut. We'll play it first and I'll tell you where it's from, unless somebody can guess. Your system. Okay. Now, for me, what is interesting about these sessions, that they bring together the Zahir and the Batin, the exoteric and the esoteric. They come together. See, on the surface, it's a social event, and the people are dancing, they're having fun, they're enjoying themselves, right? But what is important from the religious point of view is that the lyrics, the song texts, are religious. They are, in most cases, especially in the Zapin songs, derived from qasidas, odes that are produced by the poets of Hadramaut. So, for example, the first one that we played is called Farid Al-Attas. Now, and the text goes something like Farid Al-Ham Ya Kashif Al-Gham. Basically, asking God to drive away the sorrow, to drive away the pain. And this word in Arabic, gham, which means pain or sorrow, basically refers to the pain of separation, being separated from the lover. And the love here, of course, is an allegory, right? Often these poems talk about the love between a man and a woman, but it's symbolizing the separation or the love of a believer in God. This, just like the ne or the ceruling, express its pain and complain of being separated from its origins. So the human, those who feel the intimacy of God, complain about the separation, being separated from God. And this pain of separation is called gham. So this qasida is asking God to drive away that sorrow. Farrij al-ham ya kashif al-gham. And the song, the text, is full of references to God and to the Prophet. And the content of these songs, the content of the song text, are usually in reference to God, to spiritual values, and sometimes in reference to the Prophet as well. So this is the religious part. This is both the esoteric and exoteric part, in the sense that the words mean something. The words have an apparent meaning as well as an underlying meaning. So, for example, in that song Farid Al-Ham, maybe we can go back to it. In the song Farid Al-Ham, part of it says, what better Ma ahsan as-sukm min khamrat al-fam. What better intoxication than the wine, wine-covered lips. Okay, this is the zahir of it, the apparent meaning. Of course, when the Sufis talk about wine, they're not referring literally to wine. Right? A lot of the Sufis have this theme of intoxication, of sukar, of intoxication. They're not referring literally to wine because they didn't drink. They know and they consider wine as prohibited. But this intoxication refers to a state of intoxication from the love of God. So there is the apparent meaning and there's the underlying meaning which has to be arrived at through interpretation. So what you have here is a social event, which is the apparent meaning that we get from the samra, from the session. It's a social event, but underlying that social event is spirituality and worship, because the audience, the musical ensemble, and the dancers are enjoying themselves socially, and there's a lot of camaraderie among them. At the same time, due to the song text, there is the element of worship. So what you have here in that one event is the merging of the zahir and the batin, is the merging of the exoteric and the esoteric. And to me that's very interesting. That symbolizes what Islam is about or should be about. That symbolizes how Islam should be understood. Right? Because the way Islam is understood today in this country, it's nothing to do with enjoyment. It's all, sad and fear. It's basically about fear. It's about punishment, right? Not only leaving punishment up to God, but also being punished by those who arrogate to themselves the role of speaking on behalf of God. Right? So Islam has become a punitive religion. But if you look at the practice of the earlier Muslims, those who came, for example, those who came from Hadramaut, who brought Zapin to this country, to this part of the world, you look at the Qawwali music tradition of the people, the Indians and Pakistanis, right, which is also a musical and dance genre, in which the song texts are also of Sufi, have Sufi meanings. You look at these traditions. Zahir and batin, exoteric and esoteric, and we could say pleasure, entertainment, and religiosity are all combined. They are not separate. There is no such thing as this is a time to be serious and sad, and this is a time to be happy. After all, being happy, playing, for example, is also a form of worship. It's a form of ibadah. Having fun is a form of ibadah. There isn't that separation that we have come to live by in the modern world between the two, between the esoteric and the exoteric, between the zahir and the batin. So to me, Sufism is about that merger between the zahir and the batin. This is exemplified in Zapin as a musical and dance genre. And it is an attitude that should be generalized in our whole lives. Not just when we are praying, and not just when we are dancing, right? But in our whole attitude in our lives, that merging of the zahir and the batin should be our priority. And that is what is meant to be a Sufi. A Sufi is not somebody who stresses only on the batin and who withdraws him or herself from social reality and goes and meditates in the cave. That is a stereotype of Sufism. And in fact, the Ba'alwi Tariqah does not have this notion of khalwa. Khalwa meaning being alone, withdrawing yourself. The Ba'alwi Tariqah does not have this. And many tariqahs in the world, in history, were social groups involved in social activities, in social work. Even, for example, the Sanusiya fought against the colonial powers, against the colonial powers in North Africa. They fought in wars. And some members of the Ba'alwi Sufi Tariqah fought against the Dutch in colonial Indonesia. So Sufism is not the stereotypical idea of separation from and withdrawal from reality. Unfortunately, among the Malays, Zapin was very common among the Malays. We know from colonial records that it was frequently, practiced by the Malays. It's not something that was choreographed and studied. In many parts of the Malay Peninsula, there would be a kanduri. After the kanduri, people would bring out their gambus and their percussion instruments, and people would listen to music and dance. But gradually, this became something frowned upon, as we became more strict in terms of a more austere interpretation of religion. So the musical side took a back seat, and it's increasingly frowned upon. Nowadays, you go to a Malay wedding, it's very rare to find music, right? And to consider having music is something not very good, something irreligious. So the more religious families don't engage in music. So I think the attitude underlying Zapin, this merger of the Zahir and the Batin, is the way to return spirituality to our religious understanding and our religious practice. Thank you.